title of my talk today is Leadership and the Law of Love. In the past few weeks, we have gone through Exodus, the story of Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt, starting with Moses and his calling at the burning bush, to their miraculous deliverance through the Red Sea, their extended journey in the wilderness, their complaining and rebellion. Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, the Israelites worshiping the golden calf, and so on. Now we come to the end of the Exodus story. So what is our takeaway from the Exodus narrative? Is it a triumphalistic story of escape from the hated Egyptians? Is it about the superiority of Israel's ways over the heathen neighbors? Is the main point about Israel's separation and purification from their Egyptian values and priorities? Let's pick up the story after Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments and look at some of the other laws given by God to Moses and then to Israel. This is the part of Scripture that is most difficult to read by us moderns because it seems so primitive and frankly irrelevant at some times. Try reading Exodus 21 right after Exodus 20, where the Ten Commandments are, and you'll see what I mean. Read the wrong way, it seems to condone slavery and treat women and children as property. It is a much deeper and entirely different study with which we must wrestle, perhaps at another time. But for now, let's just say that it should be understood in the context of God through Moses leading a people exiled in Egypt, observing Egyptian customs, obeying Pharaoh's laws in a foreign land, to reestablishing their own identity as a people of God. But tucked in among all the supposedly primitive laws is a passage from this week's lectionary texts. So pertinent to our time, they seem to have been written to respond to yesterday's evening news. The passage is found in Exodus 22, 20 through 27, with the heading of Social Responsibility. Let's look at it, starting with verse 20. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. Whoa there, wait a minute. One could almost hear Moses protest. Didn't we just come out of 400 years of slavery and oppression in Egypt? Now that we are at the border of the promised land, aren't we supposed to conquer it, drive out all heathens, and keep them out? What about secure borders, thick walls, high fences, and properly armed and equipped border patrol agents? But God's command is clear. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were at one time yourselves aliens in the land of Egypt. In case you're tempted to think this text is taken out of context, read the fourth or the Sabbath commandment in the Deuteronomy 5 version of the Ten Commandments. By the way, did you know the Ten Commandments was written at least twice, maybe 3 times, almost identical words, except in the Exodus 20, in the Exodus 20 version, the Sabbath commandment is tied to creation, a remembrance to creation. But in Deuteronomy 5, it is tied to liberation from slavery in Egypt. The part where your family, your cattle, nor your strangers and foreigners within your gates, the part that says that they should not work on Sabbath, actually seems more contextual when the Sabbath command is tied to deliverance from slavery. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and you had to work 7 days a week to make bricks. Therefore, on my Sabbath, give your family, your employees, your cattle, your farm animals, and your servants, and all the foreigners living within your gates, give them a break. They too need rest. Okay, let's move on to verses 22 and 24. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with a sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. Wait a minute. Doesn't chapter 21 say that women and children don't have the full rights of men and are supposed to be treated like property? Here God is saying that the lowest rank of women and children, widows and orphans, should be treated with kindness and gentleness. Do not hurt them, or I will hurt you, is essentially what God seems to be saying here. Let's move on to verse 25. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. What? No interest loans for the poor? Don't you hear the children of Israel protesting? But that's downright anti-business. It's socialist and unconstitutional. What kind of law is that? Back in Egypt, the rich and middle class ruled. Weren't we brought here to occupy the promised land right there across the river? A land flowing with milk and honey? A land where we can plant vineyards and raise cattle and make money, lots of it? Now you're going to tell us that in this new Canaanite theocracy, you're going to regulate our profits, requiring us to give no interest loans to the poor? God continues spelling out his laws in verse 26 and 27. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. Okay, now this is really meddling with the free market, God. You're saying I can run a pawn shop, but if I take a man's cloak or the shirt off his back, I have to return it before sunset because it may be his only source of warmth for the night. What kind of anti-business, big brother regulatory legislation is that? A pawn shop where certain items must be returned by sundown? This promised land is not what we were expecting. When Moses made the appeal in Egypt, we all rushed forward and signed up because we wanted our own land, a land of our own, free from oppressive power, free to work, free to rest, free to acquire and accumulate wealth. We thought the promised land was supposed to be safe, secure, strong. Now Egypt, there's a strong country for you. Pharaoh's word was law. He could order his slaves and peons around. When they made it in Egypt, when you made it in Egypt, you were it. You were respected. You could do whatever you wanted with your wealth. Servants, slaves, fine clothes, glitzy jewelry, fast turbocharged chariots with 24-inch shiny chrome-plated wheels, big mansions with fountains filled with artwork, paintings, sculptures, maybe even a nice golden calf at the entry. Can you see God smiling down on his children and Moses, shaking his head and chuckling? Do you really want to go there again, back to this golden calf business? I thought we had crushed and ground up that one a few years back. It's easy to think how stubborn and rebellious Israel was in the Exodus narrative, but really, are we that different? Do we rush to the front when an appeal is made to go to a land flowing with milk and honey, but shrink away when we find out it goes against our dominant cultural narratives and requires changing our priorities and values? The story of Exodus is a story of journey. How does God, working through Moses, lead a stubborn people out of slavery and into a very different way of life. We end the Exodus story with the death of Moses and Joshua taking over. Let's look at Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 12. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah. Then let's skip down to verse 4. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, because God had laid his hand on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Earlier in this service, we honored many individuals who led our congregation through a time of transition. It is interesting in this telling of the story, there is little fanfare. Moses dies, and Joshua takes over because Moses laid his hand upon him. That's it. A transition from an iconic, larger-than-life figure to his successor. How should we navigate a similar transition? In the New Testament, there was another leadership transition, perhaps the most daunting leadership transition in all of history. Jesus himself had died, was resurrected, and had ascended into heaven, leaving his disciples to carry on his work. How would they accomplish this? Let's look at one incident recorded by Paul. In 1 Thessalonians 2, chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. The heading is Paul's Ministry in Thessalonica. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply did we care for you that we determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. Take special note of the phrase in the beginning of verse 8. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves. Not only the gospel, but ourselves. Here's the key to effectively leading others to Christ. Sharing not only the gospel, but also ourselves. The gospel, or good news, and ourselves. That's the winning formula. Paul does not say good news and solid doctrine. He does not say the good news and a superior lifestyle. He does not even say the good news alone. That's how some would have it, the gospel alone. If we could just distill the gospel or truth into a book, a video, a handout, a brochure, or a pamphlet, perhaps even a loaf of bread, and dump it on people, we will have done our job. I recall as a teen many years ago in this very church, during youth Sabbath school, we baked loaves of bread, nicely packaged them with a printed Bible verse like, "I am the bread of life," or something to that effect. And during Sabbath school time, before church, we went out to the neighborhoods above Franklin Avenue, knocking on doors and dropping off these care packages. Have you knocked on doors at 9:30 in the morning on any given Saturday in Hollywood? A few decades back, if there was any response at all, it would be a grumpy and annoyed person, still in their pajamas, telling us that they appreciated the gesture, but they would have preferred to sleep in a few more minutes. If we did the same thing today, I doubt things would be much different. The gospel and ourselves, not the gospel and a loaf of bread, or the gospel and something else? The gospel and ourselves. Moses, in the Old Testament Exodus story, introduces us to the compassionate God who cares about the widows, orphans, the poor, the aliens, the foreigners in our midst. Paul, in his letter to the Thessalonians, shares his secret formula for leading others to Christ: the gospel and ourselves.